There's a spool of bare copper wire sitting in the electrical aisle of every hardware store in America. Costs about $4. And according to a 1987 Pennsylvania Fishing Regulation Bulletin, document number FR-22-B, that wire, rigged a specific way, was quietly added to a list of restricted gear. No environmental reason given, no safety concern listed, just restricted. The Amish communities around Lancaster County had been using it for decades, and the people who fished with it weren't buying $60 lures. They didn't need to. Stay with me, because this is where it starts to get strange. The claim sounds impossible the first time you hear it. Copper wire, the kind you'd use to rewire a lamp, the kind that comes on a spool next to the electrical tape, outperforms premium tackle by a factor of 3, not 10% better. It's 3 times the catch rate. That number comes from a 1974 issue of Rural Angler Quarterly, a regional publication that most fishing historians have never heard of. The article title was Non-Standard Terminal Methods of the Pennsylvania Interior. The author didn't name the communities directly, but the description was specific enough that anyone who knew the region would recognize exactly who he was writing about. 3 times. Hold on to that number. Because the how matters more than the what, and that explanation is coming. But first, you need to understand how this was found. It started with a second-hand copy of a 1962 Pennsylvania Farm Almanac, the kind you find in a box at an estate sale, pages soft from handling, spine cracked and re-glued. Inside the back cover, tucked between the weather tables and the planting calendar, was a handwritten diagram, not printed, handwritten. 3 variations of a copper coil rig drawn in pencil with wrap counts and approximate sizes noted beside each one, and in the margin, in a careful, slightly formal hand, a note. Works even in still water, especially August. The name at the top of the page was E. Stoltzfus. If you know Lancaster County, you know that name. Stoltzfus is one of the oldest Amish surnames in the region. It's not a name that ends up in fishing patent filings or tackle industry journals. It's a name that ends up in church records and land deeds and apparently in the margins of almanacs that sat on farmhouse shelves for 60 years before ending up in a box at an estate sale for $3. This wasn't a commercial product. This wasn't someone trying to sell something. This was practical knowledge written down by someone who used it to feed their family. That distinction matters more than it might seem right now. Here is the part nobody tells you about why the rig works. Copper oxidizes in water. Slowly, continuously, it releases a faint ionic trace into the water around it. When you combine that with the mechanical vibration produced by a coiled wire moving through current, or even sitting in slow water, what you get is something that mimics the electrical signature of a wounded baitfish. Not visually, not through smell, through the lateral line. Fish have a sensory system that runs the length of their body, a row of fluid-filled canals beneath the skin that detects pressure, vibration, and low-frequency electrical change in the water around them. It's not hearing, it's not smell. It's something closer to a full-body electromagnetic awareness. Every lure manufacturer in the world has been trying to replicate that trigger for decades, through rattles, through metallic finishes, through scent-impregnated plastics. What copper does naturally, passively for $4, those products try to approximate with 100 years of engineering. The exact wrap count and the specific coil geometry are the variables that change everything. That part comes later. But the mechanism is real. The lateral line biology is established science. And once you understand it, the idea that a spiral of copper wire could outfish a $60 lure stops sounding like folk superstition and starts sounding like physics. Now here is where the story gets bigger. The Stoltzfus diagram wasn't unique. That's what matters. Because once you start looking, copper wire rigs show up across fishing communities throughout Ohio, Indiana, and upstate New York through the 1940s, the 1950s, into the early 1960s. Not in sporting magazines, not in tackle catalogs, in community records, in extension agent reports, in the kind of documentation that doesn't get digitized and doesn't get cited. In 1951, the Ohio Division of Wildlife conducted a field study on catch rates across 12 inland lake sites. The study was filed internally. It was never published in any major fishing or wildlife journal. But the summary page, which did circulate among regional extension agents, noted what it called anomalous catch performance in communities using non-standard terminal rigs. The language was careful, but the numbers weren't ambiguous. The communities in question weren't using premium tackle. By the late 1950s, this pattern was visible enough that at least a few people tried to do something with it. A Wisconsin extension agent named Earl Mossberger compiled results from 3 seasons of documented copper rig use and submitted his findings to Field and Stream. 1958. Rejected. He revised and resubmitted in 1960. Rejected again, with no substantive feedback. Here is where you should start paying attention to the edges of the story. By 1961, at least 2 state fishing regulatory bodies had received formal complaints about copper wire rigs, not from environmental groups, not from fisheries biologists worried about aquatic impact. The complaints came from tackle distributors. The language in those filings described the practice as an unfair advantage method and raised concerns about competitive integrity in recreational angling. Competitive integrity. That phrase is doing a lot of work. Because copper wire doesn't give you an unfair advantage over other fishermen. It gives you an unfair advantage over the products they're trying to sell you. And then, in 1963, a document was circulated that changes the shape of this entire story. Not a regulation, a memo. It didn't come from a wildlife agency or a university lab or a state fish commission. It came from an industry trade group. The name at the top was the Recreational Tackle Industry Association, and what it recommended, in careful, eye-measured language designed to sound like a public safety concern, would quietly erase copper wire rigs from mainstream American fishing culture for the next 60 years. That memo has a name on it. I'll show you exactly what it says. The memo was dated March of 1963. It was addressed to state fish and game commission directors across 12 states. And the core recommendation was simple. Add what the memo called exotic conductance attractants to the restricted gear classification lists already used by most state fishing codes. The language was deliberately vague, deliberately broad enough to cover copper wire rigs without naming them directly, broad enough that any commission that adopted the language wouldn't need to justify the restriction on scientific grounds. Because the category was defined by the Commission's own discretion. By 1967, the language had been adopted, nearly word for word, in Pennsylvania and Ohio fishing codes. The classification used was non-standard terminal tackle. Under that designation, copper wire rigs became technically illegal in any registered fishing competition. In commercial fishing contexts, their use became reportable, not banned outright. Just inconvenient enough, just legally murky enough, that the practice stopped spreading. It stopped being passed down. It stopped showing up in print. And within a generation, it had faded out of common knowledge entirely, surviving only in places like Lancaster County, where communities don't depend on tackle shops or fishing magazines to tell them what works. Earl Mossberger, the Wisconsin extension agent whose submissions to Field and Stream were rejected twice, never published his copper rig data. He retired in 1971. His field notes were donated to a regional agricultural archive in 1984 and are not indexed in any digital catalog. This is the part nobody tells you. Not because the information doesn't exist, because it was never convenient for it to exist anywhere visible. Here is why that matters in dollars. The recreational fishing tackle market in the United States crossed $4 billion by 1970. That number was built almost entirely on repeat purchases. Lures break, lures get snagged, lures go out of fashion. The business model only works if you keep needing to buy more. An average recreational angler in 1955 spent roughly $11 a year on terminal tackle. By 1975, that number had reached $47, adjusted for the period, figures drawn from USFWS recreational survey data. That's a 4 times increase in 20 years, during a period when real wages grew far more slowly. Nobody had to meet in a back room. Nobody had to sign anything. They just had to make one phone call to one regulator and describe a problem in language that the regulator already had a template to solve. The rig that cost $4 and lasted for years was a direct threat to a market that needed you to spend $47 a year, every year, indefinitely. The math explains the memo better than any conspiracy theory ever could. Now here is the detail that ties the whole story together. The Stoltzfus diagram from the 1962 almanac, the 3 coil variations, the wrap counts, the penciled margin note, it matches. Not almost exactly the technical drawings filed in a 1959 U.S. patent application, application number 2,894,341. The title of the application was Galvanic Fish Attractor Device. The patent was granted. The assignee was a small tackle shop in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. The shop closed in 1964, 1 year after the RTIA memo circulated. It never produced the device commercially. No retail record of it exists anywhere. The diagram in that almanac is not a copy of the patent drawing. It predates it or runs alongside it. What it means is that E. Stoltzfus wasn't working from a product manual or a fishing magazine tip. The knowledge in that margin was older than the patent. It was community knowledge that someone tried to bring to market and failed, or was stopped, or simply ran out of time before the regulatory window closed. They patented it, they built it, and then it disappeared. What's left is what you can do with it right now. 18-gauge bare copper wire, hardware store, $4 for a spool that will last you years. You coil it around a standard jig head, starting tight at the base, loosening toward the tip, so the spiral creates differential surface exposure along the length of the rig. The tight end oxidizes slower. The open end releases more ionic trace into the water. The coil itself vibrates at a different frequency than a straight wire or a solid lure body. You don't need a workshop, you don't need special tools, you need copper wire and 10 minutes. In 2009, a fisheries biology team at the University of Illinois published research on electrochemical gradient response in freshwater predators. The study confirmed that bass and walleye show measurable predatory activation in response to low-level ionic gradients in still and slow-moving water, the exact conditions where most lures underperform and where the Stoltzfus notes specifically said the copper rig worked best. The research was published in a specialty journal. It was not covered in any major fishing publication. It did not result in any commercial product being developed, because the commercial incentive runs the other direction. Think about what this actually means. Any body of water, any property, a pond on a quarter acre, a creek behind a rental, a lake access you've had for years without results. The rig that works there isn't at the tackle shop, it's in the electrical aisle. It was always in the electrical aisle. And the only reason you didn't know that is because the people who benefit from you not knowing that were better organized than the people who tried to tell you. The people who used this didn't have a tackle shop. They had a barn, a pond, and a piece of wire. And they never went home empty-handed. If your grandfather fished, if anyone in your family came from a rural community that kept its own methods and didn't trust the catalogs, I'd genuinely like to know what they used. Leave it in the comments. Because what I've found is that this knowledge didn't disappear everywhere equally. It survived in pockets. And those pockets know things the industry spent 60 years trying to make you forget. The copper wire is one item on a list. I've found 6 others. Methods, materials, rigs, all of them documented, all of them marginal by design, and all of them buildable for under $10. The next one is the most legally interesting. It's still technically permitted in 47 states, but in 3 states, it was specifically named and restricted, and the reason why tells you everything about how this system works.